Hey everyone, before I ever spend a single dollar on paid ads, there is one number I must always calculate. How much can I afford to pay for a qualified lead? Now, we've generated thousands of qualified leads for ourselves and for our clients. And in a recent client campaign, generated 454 qualified leads for one specific financial services client. Now, in this video, I'm going to be covering three things. First, I'm going to show you why a $300 cost per lead can actually produce a cheaper customer than a $100 cost per lead. Second, we'll calculate the maximum amount that your business can spend to actually generate a qualified lead. And third, I'll give you the calculator that we'll use so you can actually plug in your own numbers. But some quick context before we actually get into it. In that financial services campaign that I had mentioned earlier, we wanted to improve the financial profile of the businesses that were actually coming through and generated to our clients' CRM. So at first, 37.2% of those leads were businesses that were doing more than $500,000 in annual revenue. As we improved the campaign, that moved up to 53.4%. So when I say a qualified lead, I'm talking about someone who fit the exact customer profile that your business wants and has a real path to becoming a customer. So for a lender, that can mean the right revenue, time in business, credit profile, funding need. For an insurance company, that can mean the right industry, the location, coverage need, buying timeframes, right? Your qualification rules are really going to be dependent on your business. But the important part is that we are putting a value on your opportunity that your sales team can actually close. So for this example, let's use $40,000 as our customer lifetime value. So that means that the average customer is generating $40,000 in revenue over the full relationship. Every business is going to have a different LTV. This could come through one large purchase. It could come from monthly payments. It could come from repeat purchases over multiple years. For your business, the best LTV is the number that you have right now, not a number that you wish you had or a number that you used to have, but you have right now. And the reason why you want that number is because we want a number that we can actually make a decision against. So our first number in this case, $40,000 customer lifetime value. Now we'll need to figure out how much gross profit that customer actually creates. So what we'll do is we're going to actually adjust for our gross margin. So at a $40,000 customer value, that might sound valuable, but the business still has costs to deliver the product or the service. For example, let's say that this business has a 30% gross margin. So if we take our $40,000 customer value and we multiply it by our 30% gross margin, that means that we have $12,000 in lifetime gross profit. $40,000 tells us how much revenue the customer produces over the lifetime. $12,000 tells us how much gross profit the customer produces over its lifetime. So the gross profit number has to support customer acquisition, operating costs, and profit goals for the business. So now we have the next number in the equation, our lifetime gross profit. That leads us to the next question. How much of that $12,000 am I willing to spend to acquire the customer? That leads us to setting a target return. Now I decide what return I want from our customer acquisition. Now, this could just be a number that you are targeting. It's a number that your business has done historically. Perhaps you have investors and you're looking for a specific return on investment. For this example, let's just say 3-to-1. It's a healthy number, pretty typical benchmark. $3 in lifetime gross profit in for every $1 I spend in acquiring the customer. So we already know that one customer creates $12,000 in lifetime gross profit. Now we divide that number by 3. And so ultimately, that means we have a max cost to acquire the customer of $4,000. So 12 divided by 3 equals 4. That $4,000 is the maximum that I'm actually willing to spend to acquire one customer and still hit that 3 times target. Now we have a financial threshold that we can make decisions against. There's an important detail here though, right? That $4,000 has to cover the full cost of acquiring the customer. So before we calculate what we can actually pay for the lead itself, let's break down what sits inside of that $4,000. Okay, so inside of our $4,000 cost to acquire a customer, we have lots of different things that we need to operate the business, right? We have our lead cost, we're building our ad creative, we have our tech, we have to pay our salespeople, and then you ultimately have other costs associated with acquiring your customers, right? The exact mix is going to be really dependent on your business, but the lead itself only uses part of that $4,000. So if I have $35,000 in costs generating the leads required to just create one customer and another $1,000 turning those leads into a customer, right? From the creative, the tech, the sales, the other costs, then our total cost to acquire the customer is $4,500. So that's actually above our $4,000 max or our target. So that means that this is just not going to work for us. That puts us above the $4,000 threshold that we just set. So what I want to understand is the full cost from no customer to new customer. So you want to keep that ceiling in mind because now we can calculate how much a qualified lead can actually support. And so for that, we'll need one more number, or what percentage of qualified leads actually become customers. So now I can turn our maximum cost to acquire a customer into a ceiling for the qualified lead. For this example, let's use a 15% close rate. So that means that 15% of our leads actually turn into paying customers. We already know that our customer acquisition cost is $4,000. So if the lead was our only cost, we can simply multiply $4,000 times this 15 here. That gives us an absolute economic ceiling, $600. Now remember, the CAC is the bar that we just built. So lead cost is just one part of the greater acquisition cost. So $600 can represent the top end that these customer economics can support. Again, we're going to account for creative, tech, management, sales, labor, follow-up, and the rest of the acquisition system to set the number that we'd actually be willing to pay. But for now, let's just lock in the $600 because with that number, we can answer the question from the beginning. Can a $300 lead really be cheaper than a $100 lead? Okay, so let's test the assumption that most people make when they're trying to compare two different lead sources. So you have two companies, they're offering you qualified leads at a certain cost per lead. Source A, they offer the lead for $100. Source B, they offer the lead for $300. Which one is cheaper? At first glance, source A looks like it has the obvious answer. You're paying 1/3 the price for each opportunity, but I still don't have enough information to make the decision, right? I still need to know what happens after each lead reaches the sales team. In other words, how many of those leads actually becomes a customer? So because the number that I ultimately care about is what it costs me to acquire the customer. So let's follow both sources all the way through the funnel. So again, looking at both of these examples, source A, $100 lead, they have a 5% close rate. That means that for every 20 leads, we'll create one customer, 5% close rate. Now let's look at source B. If you have a 20% close rate, that means one of every 5 leads becomes a customer. That means for source A, $100 cost per lead, 5% close rate, one close for every 20 customers means you have a $2,000 cost to acquire the customer. For source B, at a $300 lead cost, 20% close rate, one of every 5 leads actually becoming a customer, you have a $1,500 cost to acquire a customer. Ultimately, this means that the $300 lead creates a $500 cheaper customer. Now look at what happened, right? Source B costs 3 times more on a per lead basis, but it costs $500 less to acquire the customer. That's the key part that I want you to remember. Follow the lead all the way through to the end customer. So once I know what it costs to create a customer, I can compare that number against what the customer is worth and decide which source actually makes sense. So now we have the next question. How much can close rate change what a lead is worth? So close rate can quickly change the math. I'm going to keep our maximum cost to acquire a customer at $4,000 right here. And I only change one number, that qualified lead close rate. So at 5% close, that means we have a $200 max lead cost. At a 10% close, we have a $400 lead cost. 15% means $600, and 20% means $800 max lead cost. Same customer value, same gross margin, same return target, same $4,000 maximum customer acquisition cost. The only number that we change is how often the qualified lead becomes the customer. And that moved our economic lead cost ceiling from $200 on the front end to $800 when you get your close rate up. Ultimately, the lesson here, better conversion equals more room to acquire leads. And so quality over quantity, right? If I want to support a higher lead cost profitably, I have a couple different levers that I can pull. I can improve our qualification. I can improve our follow-up. I can improve our speed to lead. I can improve the sales process. Anything that increases the percentage of qualified leads that become customers gives the business more room at the top of the funnel. And so we've seen this firsthand, how much the profile of the lead coming through can actually change. So let me show you a real example from a real campaign. So I shared some numbers earlier around one of our campaigns, 454 qualified business owner leads. At first, 37.2%. We're doing more than 500K a year. We improved the campaign to 53.4%. So the sales team had a much higher concentration of the businesses we wanted them talking to. And this is where I connect qualification back to the economics, right? A qualified lead becomes more valuable when a stronger profile creates better outcomes downstream, right? Do we contact more of them? Do we move into further sales conversations, right? Do more people actually apply and become customers? Do they create more revenue, right? Bigger businesses often can afford bigger packages. That's what I want to measure. If stronger qualification increases the chance that the lead becomes a valuable customer, then that business can support more acquisition costs for that opportunity. And ultimately, that brings us back to the $600 ceiling, which is important because we still need to answer one key question is how much of that $600 can I actually spend buying the lead? So let's answer that. We calculated a $600 maximum qualified lead cost. That's our economic ceiling. If the lead itself were the only acquisition cost, great. But in the real world, and this is the real world, I usually have a couple other costs that are associated in creating the customer. So I'm going back to the $4,000 maximum CAC bar that we built earlier. And so inside that, again, lead generation, you have your creative, tech, management, sales, other acquisition costs. So let's say we know the rest of our acquisition system costs about $1,000. That leaves $4,000 in maximum CAC minus $1,000 in other customer acquisition costs. That gives us $3,000 available for lead cost per customer. So now let's apply a 15% close rate. $3,000 times 15% equals $450 per lead. So even though the customer economics give us an absolute ceiling of $600, my practical buying target might be closer to something like $450. That's the number that we're actually going to make buying decisions against. Your number is going to be dependent on how your system is actually built. And the important part, though, is that we set that threshold before I'm spending a single dollar. Then once the campaign launches, I replace the assumptions with what actually happened. So before I launch, some of the numbers in this model are ultimately estimates. Maybe I expect qualified leads to close at 15%. Maybe I expect the average customer to be worth 40K. Maybe I set my practical buying target at $450. Those numbers just give us a starting point. Then I'll launch the actual campaign. We'll collect real data. And so we'll actually set into practice an operating loop. So first step, setting a threshold, which is the targets and the goals. Then we'll launch. Then we'll look back. We'll see the measure. We'll measure the campaign. We'll see how it actually performs. We'll see where it needs to be fixed. We'll update it. Once we'll get inside of our target KPIs, then we'll scale it up. Now that we can connect that revenue back to the actual source. Now, underneath this system, we have our advertising system, which is the ad creative, the actual funnel. We have our lead and our quality. We have our contact rates. We have our sales process. We have our customer process and our ability to retain them, ultimately leading to revenue and even lifetime revenue. So ultimately, we're connecting our revenue back to the lead source. Now, let me show you how we can actually apply these numbers into a model for your own business. And we're going to run it live with an actual calculator. Here's a calculator calculating our maximum qualified lead costs. We have a $40,000 customer value. Let's assume we have a 30% gross margin like we had shared earlier. We're targeting a 3 times return and a 15% qualified close rate. The calculator gives us a maximum cost to acquire a customer of $4,000 here and a $600 maximum qualified lead costs. Now, I'm just going to change one number like we did earlier. Let's go from 15% close rate, let's drop it down to 10%. You can see how quickly that changes things. So we have our maximum qualified lead cost of $400, right? Our maximum cost to acquire a customer, it doesn't change. If we change our profit multiplier, then it will change. But in this case, we're keeping it flat. Now let's move the close rate up. Let's call it 20%. So it jumps to an $800 maximum qualified lead costs. Everything else stayed the same. Same customer value, same gross margin, same return target. The only thing that we changed was how often those qualified leads actually turn into customers. That one change moved the economic lead ceiling from $400 to $800. That's why I want this calculator connected to real sales data. Once you know your actual closing rates, you can update the model and see where your business can actually support. And so now we can turn this into a simple decision rule. We have our customer lifetime value to our gross margin, our lifetime gross profit, our target return, our max CAC, qualified lead close rate, and our maximum lead cost down here at the bottom. Goal with this, set the threshold, launch, measure the outcomes, update the model, improve it, and then scale it, right? I want to make decisions from actual customer economics. If a lead costs more and produces customers at a better cost to acquire them, I can keep buying it. If a cheap lead source produces expensive customers, I can cut it or improve what happens downstream. And so that gives me a clear way to decide where that next dollar goes. So here's what I want you guys to do next. First, click the link in the description below. I'm going to have a calculator link. You can go there, you can plug in your own numbers, plug in your customer lifetime value, your gross margin, your target return, and your qualified close rate. And in about 30 seconds, you'll have an estimated ceiling for what your business can actually afford to pay for a qualified lead. Then compare that number against what you're paying right now. If you want help building a campaign that can actually generate qualified leads at an acceptable cost to acquire a customer, you can book a call with me at the link in the description below. We'll look at your numbers, who you're trying to reach, and what it would take to build a campaign that makes sense for your business. I will see you guys in the next one. Talk to you then.